With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm with Sabine El-Chidiac. I'm saying that really fast because we were just practicing it and I couldn't get it right. So did I get it right?
You did. You did a great job.
Huzzah! Sabine is with the Consumer Choice Center, our friends that we've had on for a long time, but she's actually Canadian in Canada, went to school in Canada, knows lots of Canadian stuff. And for us Americans and the worldwide audience, with Canada being so much in the news, we thought we'd just go to the source and talk to her directly. How are you, man? Appreciate your time.
I'm doing great. Great to be here to talk to you about this. And thanks for asking for the Canadian perspective. I appreciate that.
Yeah, full disclosure, I've been doing a lot of work with the Newsforum network up there. So I've become the designated American for them, which is cool. So I kind of wanted to flip it around because I've been paying attention to this a little bit more than maybe some folks do. I want to back up because this story did not start 2 weeks ago with Donald Trump saying, I'm going to do tariffs, and then he's going to do them. Now he's not going to do them, and they're going to back it off, and Canada's going to do what they had actually already planned to do in November. They're just going to do it now. We'll go through all that in a minute. This story's a lot longer than that because he threatened to do this during his first term, and then there's a lot of background with the Canadian economy, the Canadian leadership. Where do you think a good entry point for where we're at right now to explain it to the audience on how we got to this point in the first place from the perspective of our friends north of the border?
Yeah, well, as you said, this didn't just start in November 2024 when he first said he wanted to put 25% tariff on Canada. You do have to go back to 2018. There was the steel and aluminum tariffs. They ended up costing Americans a lot of money. The same year, there was a tariff on washing machines under President Trump. And it wasn't just washing machines because it ended up affecting dryers, which you usually pay for and buy at the same time. And that also put hundreds of dollars more on the price tag of just washing machines, something that most Americans really need in their homes. So it started there. But I would even argue that we've been having problems with tariffs since the 1930s. Between Canada and the United States. So going back to even earlier, obviously not involving Donald Trump, but the Smoot-Hawley tariffs back in 1930 during the Great Depression, they put huge tariffs on Canada. World trade fell by 66% as a result, and it prolonged the Great Depression. And then Canada retaliated, much like it's doing now, and it caused an economic depression in Canada as well. So we see throughout history between Canada and the United States in 1930 and under Trump in 2018 that these tariffs keep popping up, they keep being implemented, and they keep hurting Americans and hurting Canadians' pocketbooks. And we just continue to do them for some reason.
Now, I'm going to put pause here for just a second because it's important to understand why he focuses on Canada, Mexico, and China. Canada, Mexico, and China combined is just under half of all of American trade. The North American continent, we can talk globalism or whatever you want to, it's exorbitantly intertwined now. The economies of those three countries are connected, and you're not going to unconnect them. And one thing happens to one, it's going to happen to the other. So China's a little bit different thing because they're a hostile foreign power, at least geopolitically. The Canada and Mexico thing, this goes to the USMCA, which is up for statutory review here pretty soon. That's part of the negotiating thing. But the other part of this is Trump's a little bit of a bully to him. Even his supporters like that about him. That's not a slam. That's part of what he does. And Canada's going through a power change right now. Trudeau has already said he's going to step down. There's a lot of uncertainty. You have a parliamentary system with multiple political parties, so there's going to have to be some kind of a coalition, something to replace him. Talk about the power vacuum, because the timing of this is really bad from the Canadian point of view, because not only economically there's some stuff going on that we'll talk about in a minute, you got a little bit of a power vacuum on top of it. So Trump's really picking his spot, knowing he's not going to get a lot of pushback from a lame duck Trudeau, who let's just be honest, he's mocked him for years. That's part of this story too, is Canada's really got zero leverage here at all right at the moment.
It is very difficult politically here in Canada right now. So a few months ago, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, stepped down as the leader of the Liberal Party. He said he would stay on until they picked a new leader. That's going to happen in March. So we're likely going to have an election in March. So he's still the prime minister. He's just not the leader. He's the temporary leader of the Liberal Party for now until they find somebody else. And on top of that, he prorogued Parliament, and that means that he's ended the session of Parliament for now, and that it's not going to come back probably until the end of March. So we are in a place right now in Canada where our House of Commons is not meeting. They are not coming together to talk about these things, to debate them, to pass any legislation. They're just home. And Trudeau is doing his job as prime minister in negotiating and talking with Donald Trump, as we saw yesterday, when he helped narrowly avoid, the tariffs being implemented for another 30 days anyway. But we are in a prorogued parliament situation. We don't have a House of Commons coming together right now. So there is that power vacuum. Thankfully, the prime minister is still the prime minister and he's still doing his job in that respect. But as a democracy, our members of parliament are just not meeting right now to talk about this.
And just so we're teaching to the lowest level here, Canada has a parliamentary system very similar to the British. They have, PMQs like they do, these sorts of things. There's some differences, especially the way you do your elections. But just real quick, give people the lay of the land, because the parliamentary system is a part of this story. Parliamentary systems move at a different speed than our system does. Our system has a lot faster turnover. The political parties dictate the leadership there, so you rise in the political part. Trudeau actually resigned as the head of his party, which means he resigned as prime minister. That's a sequential thing, whereas we elect a president and the president goes away. Just walk us through the system a little bit, because you got basically 4 major political parties of note. You got other ones, but there's 4 big ones. And then the conservative and liberal parties, but those terms don't mean the same thing in Canada as here, where, your conservatives are probably center left for us, give or take. Just give us a little quick overview, because you got to understand that piece of it to understand where this is going to go from here.
Sure. So we have a Westminster-style parliament here, which means that when you pass a law, it has to go through the House of Commons, it has to go through the Senate, and finally it has to be sort of approved by the Queen through our Governor General, because we are part of, the head of our state is the king now. I said the Queen. I've been saying the Queen for so many years.
A lot of people wish it was still the Queen, so you're fine.
Yes, so the king, the King of England is the head of state here, the prime minister. That's why we don't have a president, we have a prime minister. So it has to go through, obviously they're just a figurehead at this point in our history, and they approve things, but they are still, they still have that figurehead status in Canada. So it has to go through a bunch of, our legislation has to go through a bunch of checks and balances before it becomes law. It's kind of nice, actually, that our prime minister doesn't have the same amount of power as the president in the United States to just sort of veto things or to make things happen. He has to go through a process, which I like, which I'm more comfortable with as somebody who really appreciates democracy. So it is nice in that way. One part of the story I didn't really talk about was the fact that we are getting closer to a federal election. So the parties that you mentioned, the Liberal Party, once they find a leader, they're going to start, they're already pushing back a lot against the Conservatives. The Conservatives are led by Pierre Poilievre right now, and will be for a long time, likely. He looks like he's looking really good in the polls. It looks like it might be a Conservative government next. So there is that happening in the background. But the one thing that brought together these parties were the tariffs. So it was interesting for me to see these 2 parties, or 3 parties, including the NDP, the New Democrats, which are like sort of the farther left party in Canada. They all came together to talk about the tariffs and how terrible they are and how we have to have a Team Canada approach and pushing back on them. So that actually brought together 3 parties that usually disagree on everything.
Yeah, and we've seen the viral videos of, the U.S. national anthem getting booed at hockey games and some retailers taking stuff off the shelves. How much of that is just viral video fodder? How much of this is anger? Because I've talked to some of our Canadian friends, and some of them are like, yeah, this is as angry as people have been since COVID. So the anger is real there, but there's a lot of performative to this. If we're going to accuse Trump of using performative politics with the tariffs, it's fair to say that the Canadian politicians are also using this as a rally around the flag. How much of it is real? Because of course they're upset because they got poked. How much of it is also political theater because there is that election coming up? There is a ratio there, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of both. I think the COVID point is really important here that you brought up, because I think a lot of Canadians are just getting over the economic frustrations that they had during the pandemic. Businesses are just getting back on their feet in Canada. They're not fully there yet. It's just coming to that point. And to be threatened with this tariff where it's going to make everything more expensive, people are just tired. They're tired of being in an affordability crisis. And I think that's a lot of what's driving the anger in Canada. I always worry that I'm in a bubble, because I work on this stuff and like I feel like there's a lot of anger, but is it real? But I kind of gauge it in the world outside of my bubble. I got a lot of social media messages and a lot of things from people that aren't usually politically active that I know, sharing lists of Canadian products and American products and which American products to avoid and what to buy instead that's made in Canada. And that's just from like common average Canadians who don't follow the news as much as I would, for example, because it's my job. So I think at the everyday Canadian level, they are upset because they can't afford things as it is. They're going to the grocery store and they are paying too much for like lettuce. Like we're talking about everyday essentials. It's really hard to go to the pump and pump some gas these days. It's really hard to get anything really. So when you're faced with that, plus an affordability crisis, plus a housing crisis, plus the tariffs, those people that are just making minimum wage or people who are just scraping by are scared, I think, for their livelihoods. A lot of it is political theater. It's advantageous to the Liberals for sure. The Liberals were doing very poorly in the polls, and they're jumping up in the polls now because of the way that they've been handling the tariff issue. Trump really gave Trudeau sort of a platform in which he can come back and speak to Canadians and be angry on their behalf and come to a deal. And yesterday was a really good example of that when Trudeau did appear to look like he made a deal with Trump to push the tariffs 30 days down the road. And he agreed to so many things that Trump really wanted. And so it made him look like he was sort of wheeling and dealing, and that's a good thing. People were happy with that. So it is helping the Liberals, I have to say.
You brought it up, so let's go there. There's been a lot of debate by people who are getting past the noise of it. Is like, okay, a lot of this is actually from an agreement that was made back in November. It hadn't been implemented yet because that was right around the time that Trudeau announced he was going to be stepping down. So like you said, they're like, well, they didn't implement it. Like, well, the parliament got dissolved or whatever the term is. So they couldn't implement it if they wanted to. There's a lot of crosstalk there where you can be like 70% truthful in your political spin. How much of what Trudeau did here was backing off? How much of it was Trump backing off? Because that seems to be a big part of this that folks kind of can't get their head around because everybody's got a little bit of the truth to what they're saying in it.
I find this point really interesting as a policy person. I wanted to see what the concessions were going to be, if any. So let me tell your viewers exactly what happened yesterday. So Trudeau said he was going to put together a $1.3 billion border plan, a 10,000 frontline personnel at the border. He's going to appoint a fentanyl czar. That is a term I've never heard Justin Trudeau use before, so that's definitely a Trump term.
He got that from Trump, right? Because that's not something Canadians would ever use, but that's something our White House has used for years, right? Drug czars, so forth.
Exactly. Right? Listing cartels as terrorists, a 24/7 eyes on border. These are all very American-sounding things for Canada. So it looks like he's speaking Trump's language, which is good because we want to avoid these tariffs. But these are a lot of things that we already do. So we haven't. I have to argue that Americans didn't get a lot out of this, other than perhaps Trudeau just maybe working faster on it, putting a number on it. That's possibly it. But I also want to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about like what it is that America wanted in the first place, and that's the fentanyl issue, and that's the border, right? So if we look at it, fentanyl, the United States seized about 21,800 pounds of fentanyl in 2024, and only 43 pounds of that were from Canada. And with the border, they had about a 1.6 million U.S. Border Patrol encounters with migrants in places outside legal points of entry. And 1.5% of that was in the northern border. So for me, it feels like it's a lot of like problematic wheeling and dealing for not very much that you're getting in return. So yes, we will do that. And Premier Ford also talked about Fortress AmCam. That's like a joint task force between Ontario and America to make sure that everything's happening properly in that border. Oliver, the leader of the Conservative Party, is talking about making great deals with Trump. So they're all talking that language and they're trying to go there. But it isn't that different than what we've been doing already as allies.
Yeah, and this is a point I want to get into too, is we're supposed to be allies on stuff. Like all families, we have our fusses and fights on things. But there does seem, going back to the first Trump term, and then Biden didn't do a whole lot Canada-wise, but we now know that he was, not up to the job in many, many ways. So, I don't want to beat on the guy, but, the staff was running the shop for a while there. How much of a lot of this angst with Trump comes from the first term of, oh, we're going to do this again, because they went through it the first time with Donald Trump. And unlike the American electorate, who had a response to the Biden years, they're just like, oh, we're going to do this again. Is that an element of this from the Canadian perspective, especially the Canadian government perspective, where, let's just call it what it is, Trump has used Trudeau as it's something to kick publicly pretty much since the minute he got in the spotlight. This is a long-running feud between those two guys specifically. I wonder if that's just not a whole lot of it's like, oh, we got to do this again.
Yeah, definitely. I think Canadian officials realize that he's not joking. Like, as it happened already in 2018. They don't want to go through that again at all. So an aspect of that is that, like, yes, he's serious. He's going to do it. And that's why it's so confusing now, the back and forth on this. Like, in 2018, he's going to put the tariffs. It happened. Now it's like back and forth, back and forth. So I wonder, I would like to ask you, as the American perspective, like what you think is the end goal here. If the tariffs aren't put like they were in 2018 right away, and quite aggressively, and now this like volleying back and forth, is it the appearance perhaps to make a deal? I don't want to presume to speak on behalf of Americans on like what your government is trying to do, but in our perspective, we're taking it seriously because it hurt us before, and we know that we are going through a housing crisis and an affordability crisis. It's going to hurt us massively again, and it's going to hurt Americans as well. As you know, tariffs are taxed on your own people, which means that the American people are going to be paying for these tariffs at the end of the day, just like the Canadians are when we retaliate. So I don't know. It's difficult for me to see the long-term goal here, since it's been volleying back and forth so much.
Yeah, I think the key is what you look. If I was the Trump whisperer, I would be very, very rich and have my own TV network right now. But we do have 50 years of book on the man and how he conducts himself. So I will go based off that. What you just said is the most important part of this. He's not thinking long-term. He's thinking very, very short-term. In fact, I will argue, and I think the way his administration has rolled out, we just talked to our friend Eric Garcia, congressional reporter, on the last episode. Go listen to that. We'll link it. Remember, they had the buses going into the West Wing as soon as the inauguration, before they even got off the dais. They were moving fast, Chief of Staff Wiles and these folks. They know they have a very narrow window here. Trump's popular. He's a lame duck. Congress is going to bog down really quick. Remember, we got this funding fight coming in March that's probably going to be a bomb, blows everything up. So even for an incoming president, you already only have really one session of Congress to get your stuff done, and then you're already into the midterm election. They're not thinking long-term. They're getting all the wins they can get right now. And they're trying to get them fast because they know Congress is going to be tough. They got really thin margins. They know even Trump himself starting to say, like, there's going to be some economic pain to this. So he's aware that, the goodwill on this stuff, it's very limited. This is a lot of activity. It's a lot of theater. It's a lot of quote unquote winning, because you're winning the news cycle. But like you said, a lot of this is stuff we would have got anyway. One of Trump's great assets politically is his leadership style is chaos. So he creates the problem, solves the problem, and then he gets credit for the status quo, like Canada doing this stuff, like Mexico doing what they had already said they were going to do. 10,000 National Guard on that border isn't going to really make a difference. I'm sorry. It's just not. Things like a fentanyl czar, like you're laying out, like, well, most illegal drugs actually comes through the ports of entry. They're not getting smuggled over, they're coming from Windsor to Detroit. They're coming from Ontario down into New York. They're coming from Vancouver to Seattle. That's how that stuff comes in. And it's not as much as they think it is. So it's not that those aren't problems. It's just he blows it up to make it a social media win and a news cycle win. The problem is Canadians and Americans, we're going to be Canadians and Americans after this Trump term, and we're going to be left with the bag. But that's just, they move fast and break stuff. That's what they're doing. So are they planning it long term? No, I think this is all short term planning to get the wins they can get. I think that's more of it than even an ideological or a policy thing. And frankly, I think the biggest thing with Canada, and I hate to keep harping on it, but I've heard it from too many people inside the Trump camp. I've heard it from too many people in the Canadian government. Trump just smells weakness on people, and he smelled it on Trudeau. All due respect to your prime minister, he smelled it on him from day one, and he knows I can beat this guy all day long and look good doing it. And I think that's kind of at the core of all this. He's like, I can pick on Canada and Mexico anytime I want to and get away with it.
Yeah. I think that you're right on that. And the problem is that he's sort of sidestepping the fact that we are very big. We're the second largest trading partner to the United States. So as much as he does beat on Trudeau, I mean, he's also beating on his own economy at the end of the day. We are not only the second largest trading partner to the United States, but we're also the largest supplier of crude oil to the USA. We send a lot of softwood lumber to the USA. Retaliation is not going to be good for Americans. So at the end of the day, he's not really helping his own people. So it might look like social media wins and news cycle wins and, beating up on Trudeau, but at the end of the day, he might just be beating up on his own people. Because
we talked about this on yesterday's program. Canada is one of the few countries on earth where they can affect a president quick because they can change the price at the gas pump tomorrow.
Oh yeah. Yes.
And that's I think that's one reason you're going to see Trump back off on some of this, because what is it? 70% of our crude imports come through Canada one way or another.
Yep.
It's a massive number. And look, the gas pump is the great political equalizer. We just buried Jimmy Carter. Go ask him how that works out. That one cuts through everything else and consumer prices, things like that. Let's talk economics for a minute, though, because the Canadian economy is undergirding everything in Canadian politics for about the last 15 years. You mentioned the housing crisis. I joke about it, but it's a great insight into it. Look, HGTV had to move their house buying shows out of Toronto and start doing them in Raleigh because all the Americans were like, this is not a $1.8 million house. This is a $400,000 house. So, they send them down to Raleigh where they can find $400,000 houses. I'm not exaggerating. That happened. You cannot buy a home anywhere in Toronto for less than high six figures right now. Mm-hmm. The housing crisis in Canada is really driving everything economically and politically right now. Can you explain that to the American audience? Because I think it's actually a bit of a harbinger because we're seeing the same thing in the UK right now. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to start seeing the same housing problems in America. It'll be a little different because of our size and diversity, but in metropolitan areas, you're seeing the exact same problems, especially Toronto, especially Vancouver, places like this. Even Saskatoon, I saw, which, normally because of their energy stuff, they're kind of inundated. They're having trouble with it. Talk about how that housing crisis is really underneath almost everything that's going on in Canada right now.
Oh, it's huge. I live in Ottawa, and we're having a lot of problems here with people being able to buy homes. So it is Toronto and Vancouver, but it's also places like you said, Saskatoon, Ottawa. First-time home buyers are priced out of the market. Young families can't buy a place. Just average Canadians are making an average income. Not even talking about lower income Canadians can't even make ends meet and put down payment and buy a house. It's so expensive. And a lot of that goes back to history of our politicians being really, really bad on zoning. I know it sounds really simple, but it really is that. We're really bad at allowing people to do what needs to happen. We don't let developers develop in the way that they understand would work. We have so many rules. We have so many so much red tape surrounding housing. What politicians do is they sort of use scapegoats to deal with this. They say, oh, it's because there's so many immigrants. We're bringing in too many immigrants. We would have enough houses if we just let people build houses. The essential issue is we don't have enough housing. And if we continue to raise these regulations and the zoning laws, we're going to continue to not have enough housing. So using scapegoats is what we're doing. Sorry about that. Using scapegoats is what we're doing instead of actually fixing the problem. It's a huge issue here because everything is more expensive. We haven't recovered from the pandemic economically, and on top of it, you can't buy a house. So the pressure is on for individual Canadians. The pressure is on for them to just have housing, to be able to buy a house. And when there's not enough supply of housing, what do politicians expect is going to end up happening? People aren't going to be able to own a home, and they're going to get really, really angry. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of positive action from government, both provincially and federally, to solve this problem. They just keep using excuses and pushing the issue off of them and putting it on another group of people, or like the big bad developers, or the terrible immigrants who are taking over all the housing or whatever. They're not solving the problem. So when you're making that an issue, plus people can't afford groceries, it's going to start to become very bad very quickly for Canadians and for the politicians who rely on their votes.
Yeah, Sabine's joining us from up in Canada. This turns into a circle, but here we go again, back to COVID. You wrote about this, Consumer Choice Centers wrote about this quite a bit, but one of the things they did was they went to regulation to try to deal with the COVID crisis, and it hit a lot of areas they didn't expect. It hit things like airline travel. It hit things like alcohol sales. It hit things like one of the reasons, I'll withhold the name because I didn't get permission to say it, but one of the Canadian contact I reached, I was like, this is really rich watching all these people wanting to boycott American Safe Travel Canada, when during COVID they were all like, don't you dare travel in Canada. And he's talking about like named government people names if we said them, we know. And he's like, this is hypocrisy of the first order. There's a lot of that going on. So here we are again. The government, part of the reason the Trudeau government is now going to be passing off the scene is they went to the power levers for a lot of this, and people don't like the results of it.
No, they don't. And consumers are having a hard time flying around in Canada as it is. Just to build on what you just said.
Canada's a big country. Like, you need to be able to fly to
country.
get around, right?
We need to fly to get around, and we need to allow for competition, so that we don't have to pay the same amount of money that you pay to go to Mexico for a nice little vacation to go from Toronto to Vancouver. Like if the flight to Vancouver is the same price as like an all-inclusive vacation in Mexico, I'm gonna leave you to wonder which one people are gonna pick. And that's because we have so many regulations that don't allow foreign companies to come in and fly in Canada, and like this certain percentage has to be Canadian in the company. There's so much regulation. So yes, you should vacation more in Canada. Canada's a beautiful country. I have had the privilege of traveling to every province except for PEI, but I'm working on it. And it's a beautiful, vast, wonderful country. If you want to do that, great. But you're priced out of that as a consumer in Canada, sadly, a lot of the time. That's a whole other episode.
Well, let's not bash Vancouver, because the list of cities where you can lay on the beach in your swimsuit and see a snow-capped mountain, that's a very short list in the world. Vancouver's an amazing city.
I love Vancouver. It's my favorite place.
But it's expensive.
I know, which I wish I could go more.
Yeah, go travel Canada. This brings up another point, though, because it's somewhat of a joke about how much of Canada lives close to America. I think it's something like 60% of Canadians live south of Seattle, Washington. If you just draw a line across there, it's pretty amazing. But this goes to the economic stuff we're talking about, which goes to the politics, which goes to the tariffs, which goes to anything else you want to talk about. Our countries are going to be linked forever, no matter what.
Oh, yeah.
The Trump stuff's the Trump stuff because his personality is so big. But, let's say J.D. Vance follows him up. That's not going to be noticeably different policy, I don't think. If a Democrat wins in 2028, that'll probably be a little bit different policy, but it would be a slow change. It's not going to be a drastic change because of the way our systems work. Yeah. Where does our relationship with Canada, look, we're not going to go to war. We're not going to annex Canada. You're not going to be a state because, frankly, we don't want Quebec, but we'll talk about that some other time. That's a joke, folks. You gotta understand what Bloc Quebec is. Go Google it, kids. Where do we go forward with the relationship? Do we have a way through technology and social media, like, okay, our leaderships aren't really getting along, but us, the people, can probably maybe turn down the rhetoric a little bit? Where do we go with the relationship with Canada and the U.S. going forward? Because we're going to have Trump for 3.5 more years here.
That's a difficult question because people are really upset in Canada. And I think that they have looked at the United States as an ally for so long, even when they have a president that perhaps a lot of Canadians don't agree with. We still saw each other as friends and allies. After 9/11, we were there hand in hand with the United States. And we've done that many times throughout throughout history. We've always been there for each other. And now to threaten us so boldly and to say all these things like the 51st state, like, yes, it's not going to happen, but the fact that it's being brought up, Canadians are very nice and non-confrontational, but when they get upset, they get upset. So that's my experience. When you poke the bear a little too much, Canadians don't forget it very quickly. And so I think that it's a problem that this is happening. I think that there is going to be some recovery that's going to be needed after all of this in the relationship between the United States and Canada. But I think that because we've been friends for so long, we can overcome it and move on. I think as Canadians are pretty nice people. I know that this is like a stereotype, and we're not all very nice. That's true, but we are people that will move on and work with you. We just want to trade with you, so let us trade with you. That's all. We just want some free trade, and we want to chill. We want to go to the States for vacation, and we just want to be your best friend. So just let us be that, and everything will be fine. I think.
Fine by me. We'll work through this. But look, we've only quarreled a bit, as Julius Caesar said when he tried to make peace with There's a little bit of a double standard to what you just said, though, because I'm going to quote our friend David Clement here. He said the first rule of Canadian politics is don't be America. There's definitely a feeling in Canadian politics where I've been doing coverage with our friends at the News Forum and others and following up with it. Some of this turmoil, there is a concern in Canadian politics wide, especially now that Trump's back, with the changeover in leadership that's coming and the way it's going. Now, the parliamentary system is going to make it so it's not always this, but there is a concern in some Canadian circles that, hey, we're falling into a more partisan American style politics because, and populism is probably the best term for it, but if you look historically, if you have economic, lost the ability to speak. I should go back to school. Frametown Elementary served me poorly on this one. Sorry. I'm sorry, Miss Allen. You taught me well. I'm sorry. The economic uncertainty always leads to populism and, bravado from demagogues and things like. We just know historically, this. You studied it. Canada is prone to that now because of all this economic uncertainty and because of people like Trump and because of the weakness of people like Trudeau. Historically, we know this is a problem. Is there a sense of, okay, what has served Canada well? We need to get a handle on this now, or we're going to go down this populist rhetoric, demagogue kind of road in our government if we don't get a handle on this economic situation, because it really ticked off people, and ticked off voters usually don't make super wise decisions.
That's right. That's a good question. I don't
give two examples in your essay.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know how this is going to play out, to be honest with you. Populism is already taking hold in Canada. You see it here and there. The Conservatives in Canada, as you said earlier in the episode, are not the Conservatives in the United States. They are different, but they're the same in a lot of ways as well. But they do have deep differences. What I do see is just like a resurgence of Trudeau. At the end of the day, like, the Liberals are looking pretty good right now, whereas just a couple months ago, Canadians are really upset with Trudeau, really upset with the Liberals. So yes, he might be appearing as weak, but to Canadians, he's appearing like he's stepping up and doing something about this threat against them, economic threat against them. But I do think that if we continue having to deal with these things, I mean, I saw a resurgence of nationalism in Canada that I haven't seen in a long time. Everybody got together and got really upset together, no matter which political party they are. Like, you would think maybe Conservatives in Canada would be like, yeah, Trump, he's right, because, he's doing the Conservative thing. But a lot of Conservatives were upset. They didn't want this to happen. They didn't understand why it was happening. So I don't know if it's like a resurgence of populism because in the way of like going towards Trump more as Conservatives here in Canada. I think they were actually pretty turned off by that, but what's been happening the past few weeks. So I don't know. I think we'll have to wait and see, and if that's the case. I'm not sure.
So for American audiences that want to follow along on how this is going, give us one or two things to watch in the headlines, because obviously Trump's rhetoric is going to dominate the coverage of it, because our media is built to react to whatever Donald Trump does. But what's a couple things we're watching for? We know the federal election's coming up. We know Trudeau is going to be stepping down as soon as they figure out a new leader of the party. Give us a couple things and kind of the timeline of the next few months on what's going on the Canadian side, so we can keep track of that. And then that way, when it pops up, we're like, oh, well, that's happening now because you've got a new prime minister, or oh, that's happening now because Parliament's back in session, or whatever the case may be.
So we have two important elections coming up. I think that's really an important thing to follow. First, the federal election, which has not been called yet, but it will be eventually quite soon. And the provincial election, which has been called in Ontario. And Ontario is a really big part of the story with the United States, because there's so much trade and so much relationships between the United States and Ontario in particular. So I think one thing in the headlines that I would follow if I were Americans is the responses of Premier Ford. So Premier Ford is in an election right now. He's the progressive conservative leader / premier of Ontario. He's running an election and also being the premier during a time of economic uncertainty with the United States. So seeing how he navigates this is going to be very interesting. So far, he's taken a very aggressive stance on retaliating. He wants to shut off electricity to several states of the United States. He's threatened to do that. He's threatened to rip up like the Starlink contract. He's threatened so many things. So he's coming at it very aggressively, and I'd like to see if he's going to continue to do that. I think that's an interesting aspect of the story. Whereas in Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith was a lot more like, we need to use diplomacy to figure this out. We can't retaliate because it's going to hurt us. So the premiers are not aligned 100% on the response. I think that's an interesting aspect of it. The other thing is just trying to follow if the 30 days is actually going to happen or not. What's going to happen in the next 30 days? Are Canadians going to insist that their premiers figure out interprovincial trade, for example? We have a lot of issues trading between the provinces in Canada. Are premiers going to realize now that maybe our allies that we thought were sort of very steadfast to and we can rely on aren't as reliable? Is that going to push them to start looking more inward in figuring out trade and how to supplement their economies that way? I would love that. I would love for there to be more free trade between the provinces. And if there's one thing that comes out of this tariff debacle that I would like to look at positively, is perhaps a move towards more interprovincial trade in Canada. But I want that to include free trade with the United States too. I don't want to block that, obviously, because more free trade is more freedom and more peace, which is important. So I think the second thing is just watching how the provinces, what they do in the next 30 days and what the federal government does in the next 30 days. Is it going to be productive, or is it going to just be sitting and waiting and seeing? The worst case scenario is a wait and see approach. They don't do anything. They don't try to figure things out in the meantime. The best case scenario is that they start figuring out what can be done and in a productive manner. So those are two things that I would look out for.
I want to drill down on one thing you said there, because I know it's kind of your bailiwick at Consumer Choice Center anyway, but one of the more, I don't want to mock your country, but it's absolutely bananas to me. Like, if we're going to consider provinces like states, right? Mm-hmm. Roughly, although they have their own government and the way y'all do your voting's a little differently. When you're talking about trade barriers, the idea that each state would have their own agricultural, food, and alcohol boards between them to decide whether they're going to trade with each other is absolutely insane to us.
Oh, like, it absolutely is.
That doesn't even compute. But like fuel, occupation and health safety rules, workers' compensation rules, transportation, the part of the trucker thing got way blown up and got hijacked by extreme elements. One of the things that started that is the trucking regulations are different from province to province. When you're talking about inter-province trade, Canada can, in some cases, trade with other countries easier than Providence can trade with each other. That's not an exaggeration. This is a major problem for y'all up there, and especially if you're going to talk about economic problems. Boy, that seems like an easy win. Like, hey, maybe if we just let our provinces trade with each other a little better, that could probably help our economy some. This is a huge underlying issue you could probably go for hours on, but that's something that outside of Canada, people don't think about it. They're like, well, of course Ottawa can trade with Vancouver. That's like, no, that's not actually how that works.
It really isn't. It is ridiculous. It's embarrassing, and it's long past the time for premiers to get together and actually figure this out. There was this interesting thread on X. I know, like, the place that you get your best facts from, but there was a thread that I thought was interesting from a former staffer to the former premier of Quebec, and he was pretty committed, that premier, to breaking down some barriers, and he gave up at the end because the regulations were so intertwined, in private interest too. That's an aspect that we don't really talk about. So because the regulations are so different in each province, a lot of companies have adapted to that. They've adapted to making things like, let's say, seat covers or like car parts or something in a very particular way, because that's what Ontario's regulations call for versus what BC's regulations call for, which are completely different. So these private interests are coming up and saying, oh, no, you shouldn't change the regulations because that will put us out of business. That's another aspect of the situation that's stopping politicians from really sitting at the table and making deals, because there's so many private interests at play. And also, we've let it go on for so long that so many regulations have appeared and have taken a life of their own, and become so intertwined in law in each province. So it's very difficult to unwrap all of those the vines of regulation are very hard to unwrap after many, many years of them existing. So we need the political will from provincial leaders to do this. I'm hoping this is the real thing that happens that forces them into that political will. I think Canadians are upset enough that they're going to call on their premiers to do a better job on this. I hope they do, because it's long overdue. We actually had a Supreme Court case called Comeau, RV Comeau, where this guy was just transporting alcohol from Quebec to New Brunswick, and he was pulled over and charged like $300 for it because he's not allowed to do that. That is from one province to another. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ended up ruling that it's not their problem. This is a provincial thing, and provinces should decide this. So even the Supreme Court of Canada won't touch it. It's a really complicated issue, but hopefully this is a thing that gets it to go to the forefront and actually get dealt with.
So I want to be a peacemaker here between our two countries. I love Canadians.
Please.
My sweet mate in college was from Canada. We made him an American, but still, we want to all get along here. We share a border. Yes. We have a long intertwined history. We all love each other. Even though we won't let you have the Stanley Cup back, we still have great affection and revere for you folks. I've got a solution. I think we could make peace over all this if we just gave Canada like 50 Waffle Houses. Please. I think this would culturally bridge the gap. I think we would share our culture with you. I think it would bring some of the best of America to Canada. What say you?
We already have a lot of American brand restaurants, and we love them. Like, I am a Chipotle girly, let me tell you. If I see a Chipotle, I'm stopping my car. And that is an American brand that I love. Waffle House is something I really, really love, and if we could bring it to Canada, I would be so happy. I was telling you earlier about my trip to Atlanta, Georgia. Some of the nicest people I've ever met work at that Waffle House that I went to. They were so excited to meet me, to find out that I'm Canadian and that I've never had grits before, properly made from a southern kitchen. So they were very excited to make that for me, and to bring me all kinds of foods that I hadn't tried before, just to make me feel at home. And that's food has always been a really good bridge between friends when they're having a little tiff. So I absolutely agree. Let's do it.
You probably didn't go at 3 a.m. when all the drunks are working it off. It's a little different experience. It's more like a Calgary pay night. But anyway, Sabine, this has been really good stuff. Let folks know where they can follow you. We're going to link. She's got about 3 or 4 articles on the stuff we talked about. We're going to link to all that, heardtell.substack.com. We're going to link to the social media as well. Make sure you're following her on Twitter and all our other places. Let folks know where they can follow you and keep up with you and our other friends at the Consumer Choice Center.
Well, I'm very involved in Twitter right now when we're talking about, or X, when we're talking about tariffs. So at Sabine El-Chidiac, follow me there to hear everything I'm thinking about on tariffs. We also have a website called freetradeforus.com that we are updating often on this tariff issue and talking about how much things are going to cost if we do implement these tariffs. I think that's an interesting resource for people. And just follow us on every social media you have, just myself and the Consumer Choice Center, because we're talking a lot about these issues if you're interested in that.
I'm also going to link to a YouTube photo. You moderated a discussion on tariffs between our friends David Clement and Yale Osowski, both people who have been on this program multiple times. In fact, I was on with David right before we recorded this, but that's a really good 25-minute explainer, and you moderated it. And wrangling them too, I've done it before for media. Not the easiest thing to do sometimes. You did it well, but we're going to link to that, a great little 25 explainer on tariffs from the Canadian perspective. Sabine, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it, ma'am. Thank you.
It was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon. Thank you, ma'am. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.